Hello and welcome to ELA Plus, your free guide to English studies and the English language arts. I'm your host, Brian E. Denton. In today's video lesson, we conclude our exploration of the major metrical feet in English verse with a look at the Pyrrhic. The Pyrrhic can rightfully be described as a ghost foot, because while many people claim to have seen one, the truth be told, it doesn't really exist. Fitting then that this video should appear in October in the thick of spooky season. So let's get to it then. The ghost foot, the Pyrrhic. The first thing we'll do in this video lesson is define the term Pyrrhic. After that, we'll make the argument that, like the spondee, this foot should really be considered a rhythmical variation rather than an independent metrical foot. Then we'll look at some examples of the Pyrrhic foot, or will we, in the poem Sailing to Byzantium by W.B. Yeats. As always, we'll conclude with some comprehension questions. Alright, so what we like to do at ELA Plus when we define our terms is first take a look at the definitions provided by various reputable sources in the reference and poetry literature, and we use these to formulate our own unique definition. To that end, let's start with the Poetry Foundation, who defines the Pyrrhic as a metrical unit consisting of two unstressed syllables in accentual syllabic verse, or two short syllables in quantitative meter. Though regularly found in classical Greek poetry, Pyrrhic meter is not generally used in modern systems of prosody. Unaccented syllables are instead grouped with surrounding feet. Moving right along, we next go to Timothy Steele. Mr. Steele defines the term as a foot consisting of two metrically unaccented syllables. This definition is taken from the great book All the Funds in How You Say a Thing, an explanation of meter and versification. This book, by the way, is one of the great introductory books to the topic of poetic feet and meter. If you're a poetry nerd, and what are you even doing with your life if you are not, then you should definitely have this book in your library. So from these definitions, we gather that a Pyrrhic is a metrical foot of two syllables, and a Pyrrhic has two unaccented syllables. ELA Plus therefore defines the Pyrrhic as a two-syllable foot consisting of two unaccented syllables. Now, we want to stress that we struggled mightily with this definition. We decided to define the Pyrrhic as a two-syllable foot consisting of two unaccented syllables, even though, as we'll shortly argue, we do not believe the Pyrrhic is really a metrical foot at all. We define the term this way because in your English language studies you are bound to come across the term Pyrrhic, and when you do, we want you to be able to identify what the Pyrrhic is. Just remember though, that while the Pyrrhic is a two-syllable foot consisting of two unaccented syllables, it is actually, like its evil fraternal twin the spondee, actually a rhythmical variation rather than a metrical foot. Let's now look deeper into why that's the case. The first thing to understand is that the English language is a stressed-timed language. This means that when we speak English, the syllables in any given sentence will alternate between accented and unaccented syllables. This is also why the majority of English poetry is written in what we call accentual syllabic verse. That is, poetry that is measured by the number of accented and unaccented syllables. So, given that English is stress-timed, it follows then that it is impossible to write a poem composed entirely in Pyrrhics. An accented syllable is bound to show up somewhere. Edgar Allan Poe, a favorite here at the channel, goes so far as to say that the Pyrrhic, much like having the prescience to optimize your starting lineup in fantasy football every week, is something that simply does not exist. The Pyrrhic, Poe writes, is rightfully dismissed. Its existence in either ancient or modern rhythm is purely chimerical, and the insisting on so perplexing a non-entity as a foot of two short syllables affords, perhaps, the best evidence of the gross irrationality and subservience to authority which characterize our prosody. In a word, we can form no conception of a Pyrrhic as an independent foot. It is a mere chimera, bred in the mad fancy of a pedant. Oof, Edgar coming in hot. Timothy Steele, however, takes a more nuanced view when he writes that true Pyrrhics perhaps appear in English in only two cases. The first is when the rhythm of a poem or passage is so close to the metrical norm that a foot with two relatively light syllables really does stand out as unusual. The second is when the syllables are spoken with the same degree of emphasis. That's why even metrists who believe that English verse often features Pyrrhics regard them merely as variants in other measures. Let's now take a look at a stanza from W.B. Yeats's poem Sailing to Byzantium to see what Steele is talking about. Here we have the second stanza of that wonderful poem. It reads, "An aged man is but a paltry thing, a tattered coat upon a stick, unless soul clap its hands and sing, and louder sing for every tatter in its mortal dress. Nor is there singing school, but studying monuments of its own magnificence. And therefore I have sailed the seas and come to the holy city of Byzantium." Let's look closely at the first two lines of this stanza to find an example of what we might, I stress might, call a Pyrrhic foot. The lines read, "An aged man is but a paltry thing, a tattered coat upon a stick, unless." Let us recall that English is a stress-timed language, and most English poetry, this poem included, is written in accentual syllabic verse. With that in mind, let's first break down these lines into their syllables, and then try to find the accents to identify the Pyrrhic. Here is the syllable count. We can see that each line has 10 syllables. Now, we haven't studied meter yet in this series on poetic feet and meter in English verse. That's our next lesson. But in another series, our series on Shakespeare's sonnets, we have briefly covered the subject of meter. For those of you watching that series, does anyone know what kind of meter Yeats uses here? Let me know down in the comments. For those of you who don't know, that's fine, no problem. As I said, you'll learn shortly in our next video lesson in this series. For now, let's find each line's accents so we can identify what poetic foot this poem is composed in. Here we find the accented syllables in bold. Can you locate the Pyrrhic feet in these lines? Did you locate the Pyrrhic as the third foot in each line? If so, good for you. For extra credit, what are the other feet in this poem? We've studied it already in another video lesson. Let me know down in the comments if you remember what foot this is. But, are these truly Pyrrhics in the third foot of each line? Let's turn again to Timothy Steele and his analysis of these lines. Timothy writes, "Consider the second line of Yeats's poem and the supposedly Pyrrhic upon. Our dictionary tells us that upon is accented on its second syllable. On may not be as heavily stressed as coat in the overall context of the line, but it takes more of a stress than the up, with which it shares the line's third foot. The third foot of Yeats's first line is more complicated, but it too would appear to be an iamb. Emphasis drops after the noun man and rises on the word but, which is a word important to the sense of the line. The upshot here is that we're using these lines of Yeats to illustrate our point that the Pyrrhic is more of a rhythmical variation than it is a true metrical foot. So when you are doing a scansion of a poem, and you come across a foot that appears to be a Pyrrhic, I would urge you to ask yourself if it's not an iamb, a trochee, or even part of a dactyl, an anapest, or an amphibrach instead. In fact, if the rest of the poem that you're scanning is written in a certain foot, it's probably best, if it's not too disruptive, to consider the atypical foot to be in accord and union with the rest of the line, like Timothy Steele argues about these lines. And that completes not only this video lesson, but also our coverage of the English language poetic feet. Yes, there are many, many more types of poetic feet in the language, but you are unlikely to ever encounter them in your studies or personal explorations of our great language. In this video lesson, we first defined the term Pyrrhic, then we argued it's really more of a rhythmical variation than a metrical foot, and then we illustrated this argument by looking at a stanza from the W.B. Yeats poem Sailing to Byzantium. And that should be enough for you to understand that a Pyrrhic is a two-syllable foot consisting of two unaccented syllables. Just to make sure you get it though, let's now turn to our comprehension questions. Number 1. What is a Pyrrhic? Number 2. What is accentual syllabic verse? Number 3. Scan the following line from Keats's The Eve of St. Agnes. Like pious incense from a censer old. If you believe the Pyrrhic is a legitimate foot, and may the spirit of Edgar Allan Poe forgive you if you do, where is the Pyrrhic in these lines? If, however, you side with ELA Plus and Timothy Steele in believing that the Pyrrhic is a mere rhythmical variation, then how should the seemingly Pyrrhic foot be scanned instead? And that concludes our video lesson on the Pyrrhic. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did enjoy it, please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing with a friend. That would really help us grow the channel. ELA Plus is a free supplemental guide to English studies and the English language arts. Turn on notifications for our regularly updated content. Until our next lesson, keep reading, get obsessed, and take care of yourselves and others. Thank you.